Acceptance is not an intellectual event. It's not a single moment when the mind declares, "I'm over it now." It's a slow, sometimes painful practice, a quiet, bodily recognition that the past will not rearrange itself to suit our wishes. It's waking up one morning and realizing that the person you once waited for is not coming back, and somehow. That's okay. The ache remains, but it no longer defines the entire landscape of your heart. You can still love them, but you no longer need them to love you back in order to feel whole. That's what acceptance does. It frees love from possession. It allows us to keep what was beautiful without clinging to what is gone. But how do we practice it? How do we live without closure in a world that constantly tells us that peace must come from resolution? It begins, I think, with surrendering the fantasy of the perfect ending. We are raised on stories that conclude neatly, with reconciliation, or clarity, or justice. We are taught to believe that when something ends, there will be a clear reason, a moral, a bow tied around the pain. But real life is rarely so symmetrical. People exit mid-sentence. Apologies never come. The truth remains blurred. And still, life insists on continuing. So, to live without closure is to live with questions unanswered and still choose to participate in life fully. It is to understand that peace is not the absence of confusion. It is the ability to hold confusion with grace. There's a kind of maturity that only arrives when we stop insisting that pain must be explained in order to be released. In love, especially, we often want to turn heartbreak into a clean narrative. I was right. They were wrong. This was the reason. But real healing rarely comes from assigning roles. It comes from expanding our understanding of what it means to be human. To accept is to say, I may never understand why you did what you did, but I can understand that you, too, were trying to make sense of your own needs, your own fears, your own longing. And when we see this, when we allow the other person their full complexity, the story stops being about fault and becomes about humanity. Because closure through acceptance isn't about winning, it's about widening. I remember a man once told me, "She left without saying goodbye. How can I move on without that?" And I said, "Perhaps the goodbye isn't a moment between you two. Perhaps it's a moment between you and yourself. Goodbye is not always spoken. Sometimes it is lived. It's lived in the way you stop checking your phone for their messages. It's lived in the moment you delete the photos and realize you don't need to scroll back anymore. It's lived in the moment you tell the story differently, not as a tragedy, but as a passage. That's acceptance. Not the disappearance of love, but its transformation. Closure, then, is not the closing of a door. It's the opening of a window. There's a deep tenderness in allowing yourself to grieve without explanation. We often resist grief because we think it will drown us. But grief, when allowed to flow, is not the enemy. It's the movement of love in the absence of its object. It's the proof that what mattered, mattered. When you grieve, you are not weak. You are honoring your capacity to care. Acceptance begins when we stop fighting our grief as though it's something to fix. We don't fix grief. We befriend it. We let it sit beside us, whisper its stories, and eventually we notice it speaks softer than before. Over time, the voice of grief becomes the voice of remembrance, and remembrance, when held with acceptance, is no longer heavy. It becomes something you carry gently, like a photograph in your wallet, or a song that makes you smile and ache at once. That is closure, not the erasure of the past, but the softening of its edges. Acceptance is also an act of humility. It asks us to recognize that we are not the authors of every chapter. Some parts of our story are written by others, some by circumstance, some by mystery. And sometimes closure means bowing before what we cannot control. We are taught to believe that agency equals mastery, that we should always have power over our outcomes. But there's another kind of strength, the strength to allow life to remain unfinished, to look at the unresolved, the messy, the unanswered, and still find beauty in it. You see, love doesn't always complete itself in the way we imagined. Sometimes the relationship was meant to awaken something, not to last forever. Sometimes the heartbreak was the initiation into a deeper knowing of ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, closure is not the moment we stop loving them. It's the moment we start loving ourselves more than our need for an ending. Let me ask you something. What would it mean to live as if nothing needed to be concluded? What would it mean to accept that not every story resolves and that perhaps its incompleteness is part of its truth? When we no longer demand closure, we start living in the present again. We stop rehearsing the past, stop imagining the alternative version of what could have been. We return to now, to breath, to movement, to the quiet miracle that despite everything, we are still here, still feeling, still capable of love. Because life isn't waiting for us to finish processing the last chapter before it begins the next one. The next moment is already arriving, ready or not. And acceptance is simply the decision to meet it with open eyes. Pain, when we stop running from it, becomes a teacher. But it does not teach in words. It teaches through presence, through the raw, unfiltered truth of our own experience. When we accept, we begin the process of emotional alchemy, turning pain into understanding and understanding into wisdom. Not by dissecting it endlessly, but by feeling it fully. You see, the paradox of closure is this. The more we try to think our way to peace, the farther away peace becomes. It's like trying to smooth the surface of a lake by touching it. The ripples only multiply. But when you stop resisting, when you let the water settle by itself, clarity appears naturally. Acceptance is that stillness. It's the moment the mind finally steps aside and the heart begins to breathe again. We often imagine healing as forgetting, as the gradual fading of the person, the memory, the ache. But real healing is not erasure. It's integration. It's when the story stops being something that happened to you and becomes something that lives within you. You no longer replay it as a wound. You carry it as wisdom. There's a softness that comes after heartbreak, but only when you stop trying to armor yourself against it. You start to see that the very thing that broke you also expanded you. That loss, in its strange, painful way, is an invitation to see more deeply, to feel more deeply, to love more wisely. It's the fire that refines, not the one that destroys. I once met someone who said, "I don't want to talk about it anymore. If I do, I'll never move on." And I said, "You move on through it, not around it." Avoidance keeps pain alive. Acceptance lets it transform. There's no timeline for this transformation. For some, it takes months. For others, years. Acceptance does not rush. It arrives in small, almost imperceptible gestures. It's the moment you stop needing to know what they're doing now. It's when you catch yourself laughing and realize you hadn't thought of them all day. It's when the song that once shattered you now makes you smile with tenderness instead of pain. Those are the quiet miracles of closure, the invisible steps toward freedom. But let's be honest. Acceptance doesn't feel peaceful at first. It often feels like defeat. It feels like letting go of the rope you've been pulling for so long, the one connected to your idea of how things should have been. You've built an identity around the struggle, the one who was hurt, the one who needs an answer, the one waiting for the apology. And suddenly, acceptance asks you to set all of that down, to no longer be the one who needs, to no longer hold on to the past as proof that you were right, or wronged, or deserving of more. And that can feel terrifying, because if you let go of the story, who are you without it? But that's the invitation, to discover yourself beyond the narrative of pain. Closure, in truth, is less about finality and more about expansion. It's not the closing of a chapter, but the widening of perspective. You begin to see that this person, this ending, this heartbreak, it wasn't a detour from your path. It was the path. It brought you face to face with the parts of yourself that needed tending, your capacity for attachment, your longing for control, your fear of abandonment, your desire to be seen. When you accept, you realize that what you lost was not just a person, but an idea of yourself that existed only in their presence. And what emerges in the aftermath is something far more authentic. You, unmirrored, unperformed, unanchored. That's where freedom lives. Sometimes I think closure is the moment you stop waiting for the other person to return what they took, and instead you reclaim what was always yours, your power to love, to forgive, to begin again. Acceptance, then, is reclamation. It's saying, I may not have the ending I wanted, but I have the agency to write what comes next. I may not understand why this happened, but I can choose how it shapes me. We often look for closure in conversations with others, but the most powerful closure comes from a conversation with ourselves. The one where we say, I release you. I release what I hoped you would say. I release the version of me that needed your validation. That's not coldness. That's liberation. And as you do this, something subtle but profound begins to shift. Your pain stops being about them and starts being about you, about your own awakening, your own growth, your own evolution. You begin to notice that what once consumed you now instructs you. You begin to trust the impermanence of things not as loss but as movement. And movement is life. Because life, in its essence, never pauses long enough to hand us closure in the form we expect. It keeps flowing, changing, inviting us to step into what's next. The question is not, did I get the answers I wanted? The question is, am I ready to live without them? And that is the real threshold of healing, the moment when curiosity replaces control, when presence replaces obsession, when acceptance replaces explanation. What if closure was simply the quiet confidence that you can hold what once hurt you without flinching, that you can remember without reliving, that you can love without needing to possess? Because ultimately, acceptance is the ability to stay open to yourself, to life, to love, even when it did not unfold as you hoped. That openness, that's where wisdom resides. It's where love returns, not as longing, but as peace. Forgiveness is a word we often misunderstand. We imagine it as a gift we give to another person, a way of saying, what you did is fine. But forgiveness, in truth, is an act of personal liberation. It is not the approval of what happened. It's the decision to no longer let what happened define the way we love, trust, or see ourselves. When we hold on to resentment, we remain entangled with the person who hurt us. We are still in dialogue with them, even in their absence. Every thought, every replay of the past keeps them alive in our emotional system. And forgiveness, when it comes, cuts that cord. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with quiet acceptance. I release you from my story. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering differently. It's looking at the same memory, but through the eyes of compassion instead of pain. But forgiveness cannot be forced. It doesn't arrive through willpower. It arrives through surrender, through the gentle loosening of the grip we've held on the past. Surrender, too, is often misunderstood. It is not weakness. It is strength in its most spiritual form. It is the recognition that fighting reality will never rewrite it. That the energy we spend clinging to the why is the same energy that could be nurturing our becoming. To surrender is to whisper, I will stop demanding that this makes sense. I will let it simply be. And in that letting be, something extraordinary happens. The world doesn't collapse. You do not disappear. You soften. And in softening, you find yourself again. The inner conversation that leads to acceptance often begins as resistance. It sounds like, I can't believe this happened. Then, why did this happen? Then, it shouldn't have happened. And slowly, quietly, it transforms into, it did happen. That single shift, from disbelief to acknowledgement, is the birth of closure. Acceptance doesn't happen in one sweeping revelation. It happens in whispers. It happens when the questions start to lose their urgency, when your need to rewrite the story becomes smaller than your desire to live beyond it. You begin to realize that what you were searching for in answers was not truth. It was safety. And once you can hold yourself in your own safety, the answers no longer matter as much. There's a story I once heard of a man who wrote unsent letters to his former lover every night for months. Each letter began with the same line, "You never gave me closure." But one evening, something changed. He sat down, pen trembling in hand, and wrote, "You never gave me closure, but maybe you were never supposed to. Maybe that's my work, not yours." That is the moment when grief matures into grace, because closure, ultimately, is not a gift we receive. It's a responsibility we accept. It's the act of choosing not to remain defined by unfinished stories. In acceptance, we stop waiting for the past to behave differently. We stop asking the same question, "Why did this happen?" and begin asking a new one, "Who am I now? Because it did." That's the pivot, from victimhood to authorship, from what was taken to what can now be created, from the wound to the wisdom. And isn't that what it means to be alive? To transform every ending into a beginning? To allow the heart to break, not as a finality, but as a doorway to greater depth. Acceptance doesn't end the story. It changes the storyteller. Sometimes the hardest part is forgiving ourselves, not for what we did, but for what we didn't know then, for the way we stayed too long, or the way we didn't stay long enough, for the ways we loved imperfectly, out of fear, or hope, or hunger. We replay the scenes, imagining what we could have done differently, as if rewriting the past could heal the present. But self-forgiveness is the ultimate act of acceptance. It says, "I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. Now, I know more." And in that knowing, you begin to live with greater tenderness, for yourself, for others, for the mystery of it all. We are not meant to emerge from heartbreak unscarred. We are meant to emerge more real. When we forgive, when we surrender, when we accept, we reconnect, not necessarily with the person, but with life itself. The walls we built to protect ourselves start to crumble, and beneath them, we rediscover something ancient and unbreakable, our capacity to love again. Because acceptance is not the end of love. It's love matured, love unpossessed, love that exists without needing to be returned. It's the recognition that what we lost was never truly lost. It simply changed form. Love doesn't vanish. It transforms into memory, into wisdom, into compassion. It becomes part of the invisible thread that connects every ending to every new beginning. And when you finally arrive there, when you can hold your story, your loss, your longing, with both tenderness and distance, you realize that closure was never about finishing anything. It was about returning home to yourself. That is where peace lives, not in the explanation of the past, but in the acceptance of your present. Not in the closing of the heart, but in its reopening. Not in the answers, but in the quiet truth that you have survived what you thought would break you. And in surviving, you have become more human, more whole, more alive. When acceptance finally settles in, it does not arrive with fanfare. There is no grand revelation, no moment where the sky parts and the pain dissolves. It arrives quietly, like dawn after a long night, subtle, soft, and certain. You don't even realize it at first. You simply notice that you've stopped fighting life, that you've stopped rehearsing the same scenes, that you've begun somehow to live again. Acceptance isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your truth. It's when you stop asking what was meant to be and start shaping what can still be. It's when you stop waiting for someone to return and start returning to yourself. Because closure isn't about closing the door. It's about walking through it. We live in a culture that glorifies certainty. We like conclusions, definitions, labels, diagnoses. We want to know where we stand, what it means, how it ends. But life is not a report. It's a poem. It's not meant to be solved. It's meant to be felt. And when we approach closure as if it were a problem to fix, we rob it of its deeper wisdom. Closure is not the ending of the story. It's the evolution of the soul. Every love, every heartbreak, every unanswered question, they are the raw materials of our becoming. Acceptance is how we integrate them. It's how we turn our experiences into belonging. Integration happens when you stop separating your before and after. When you no longer see the person you were before the pain as lost, but as the seed of who you are now. When you realize that the heartbreak didn't destroy you, it revealed you. There is a quiet power in that. You start to see your life as a continuum, not a collection of fragments. You begin to trust that every loss was part of a larger unfolding, that the meaning of something is not found in its ending, but in its effect. Sometimes the greatest gift of an ending is the self that emerges in its wake, the one who has learned to stay open even after being broken. To live without closure is to live in dialogue with mystery. It's to wake each day not needing to know what it all meant, but simply being willing to meet what is. It's to hold joy and sorrow in the same hand, knowing that neither is permanent. It's to understand that peace does not come from answers. It comes from intimacy with uncertainty. When you can stand in that space, between knowing and not knowing, and still choose to love, to try, to begin again, that's when you are truly free. Freedom is not detachment. Freedom is the courage to feel everything and still move forward. There's a line I once wrote in my own journal. Maybe closure is not the closing of pain, but the opening of perspective. The moment you stop looking backward and start noticing how far you've come. The moment the story that once defined your suffering begins to define your strength. Acceptance changes the way you speak about what happened. Instead of, "They hurt me," you begin to say, "That experience shaped me." Instead of, "I wish it had been different," you whisper, "It was, and I'm still whole." That subtle shift changes everything, because closure doesn't rewrite your past, it reclaims your power over it. And as you integrate, something unexpected happens. You start to thank the very things that once shattered you. Not because the pain was good, but because you grew good through it, because it carved space in you for depth, for empathy, for truth. The world doesn't need more people who've never been broken. It needs people who have been broken and rebuilt themselves with kindness. People who have faced the silence of not knowing and found beauty there. Acceptance gives birth to that kind of beauty, a beauty rooted in resilience. You might notice, too, that as you live with acceptance, your love changes texture. It becomes less about needing and more about appreciating, less about permanence and more about presence. You begin to love without the demand for certainty, without the illusion of control. You begin to love because you can, not because you must. And perhaps that's the truest form of closure, the ability to keep your heart open, even after it's been broken. The ability to trust that love will find you again, not in the same form, but in the same spirit. Because love, like life, doesn't end. It transforms. So, if you find yourself tonight still searching for closure, still waiting for that perfect conversation, that apology, that clarity, pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, what if I stopped waiting? What if I chose peace instead of answers? What if I let the unfinished remain unfinished and lived anyway? Because closure isn't something you wait for. It's something you become. And when you do, when you accept the story without needing to rewrite it, you become someone new. Someone who doesn't chase meaning, but embodies it. Someone who doesn't need certainty to feel safe. Someone who trusts the flow of life, even when it doesn't follow your script. You become, in a way, your own closure. Not a sealed door, but a steady heartbeat. Not an ending, but an ongoing beginning. So, let me leave you with this. Closure doesn't come from the answers others give you. It comes from the acceptance you give yourself. It comes when you stop searching for the final word and start writing the next sentence. When you realize that peace is not what happens when life explains itself. Peace is what happens when you stop demanding that it should. Because the story doesn't need to make sense for you to move forward. You only need to accept that it's yours. And in that acceptance, you become the author of what comes next. You don't need closure to be whole. You just need to trust that you already are.